Hey everybody, this is Robot from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. For all things Vespa, check us out on the web, ScooterWest.com. So what do I have here? The fuel tank to the P200 that we're fixing up, the resale. This is part 5 of my video on getting a P200 up and running and safe for the road that's been sitting mothballed for several years. You have the fuel tank. Anytime the fuel's sitting in there for a year or more, it usually tends to go stale, so minimum you want to drain the fuel. Well, the fuel in this tank's been sitting a lot longer, and inside smells pretty bad. I see varnish in the bottom. It's fortunately not rusted out. It's very clean on the top. So we're gonna have to overhaul this fuel tank and go through all the steps I do to overhaul it, along with the other systems part of the fuel tank, which include the fuel tap, or petcock, that controls the fuel flow and also adds a reserve position, which is your last amount of fuel in the tank. Oil tank, it's just a 1.5 liter reservoir for the 2-stroke oil. You can see it's all original. This tank remarkably doesn't have any cracks in it, but I don't trust it. It's old plastic. We're going to replace it, along with these crispy old lines that you can't even see through. So first of all, we'll take apart the tank. I'm gonna wanna clean it out. Don't wanna leave any of that varnish behind. If you have a severely rusted tank, it may be just more economical to replace the tank. But this scooter's still a nice original blue tank and just has fuel varnish that we can dissolve with solvent or acetone or any type of strong solvent that will eat that up without eating up the tank. So in order to do this job, you're gonna need one special tool. Part number on this is Tool FT. It's a special crow's foot style tool for removing the nut that secures the fuel tap. Very important to use. This is an original Piaggio tool made in Italy from the 60s or 70s. Been using it in the workshop for years. But the reproductions that we have available look identical to this tool. You need some basic tools, a socket set with a couple long extensions, and you'll see when I get further into the video. Like I stated, I'm going to replace that oil tank. You can get the complete Italian-made oil tank. This is the original Vespa part. Includes a new sight glass, which is also a plastic part that tends to fail. 297175 PA for this. You're gonna need a fuel line. This is very similar to the original fuel line. It's a 7mm hose. And right now it's a little bit too long. We'll trim that when we get installed. 146504 for this fuel line. You're gonna need the oil line. This is the original Piaggio oil line. It's a much thicker wall tubing than something you'd find locally. CM002311 is the correct part number for fuel line, and it's already cut the length. Very important you use this type of fuel line. It does not kink over on itself unless you really, really try, which is important. A lot of lines will do that, and they're not clear where you can visually have the visual cue that oil's flowing with a bubble to help you notice that. So those two parts typically need to be replaced. We're gonna do something special on this scooter. I'm gonna have to replace the fuel tap. Unfortunately, the original fuel tap for the American market fuel lever that we wanna retain on this scooter is no longer available, but we're gonna be able to rebuild this brand new fuel tap with the correct fuel selector, which I have a used part, so it will work with the vintage style plastic fuel lever that's found only on the American market models. Regular fuel tap is 158793. For instance, this was broken and you need to put a fuel tap. I'd recommend EFL lever kit. EFL lever dash kit, and it's a complete kit of all the parts. It comes with a cover plate for where that plastic thing would go, and this is the standard European reserve closed lever, which works with this fuel tap in the correct positions. But we're not going to use this, just want to show that part that you typically would want to use. A couple other gaskets, the fuel lid gasket 002319. There's going to be 2 gaskets for the for the oil tank. 156491 is the top one, and the lower gasket, which is this one, 156039. 2 gaskets that we're going to replace in there. If you're just taking the fuel tap out, you could certainly buy the 2 gaskets that are part of the fuel tap, but we're definitely just replacing the fuel tap, so these are included. The 4-hole gasket, if you want to replace it, 013836, and the gasket at the bottom of the fuel tap is 13993. All right, enough of the parts. Let's get this tank apart. So I have my vise equipped with a rubber jaw clamp there so I don't damage the paint. That's pretty important, you know, trying to keep this scooter as original as we can. So you can see, not necessarily with the camera, it's a nice dark hole. You pretty much want to find the nut that's at the bottom of the fuel tap. So I have a fuel tap right here. So there's a nut that normally resides right here, and that's what we're going to go into the fuel tank and grab that nut. So it's nice when it's bolted into a vise. It makes the job a lot easier. And you're just gonna want to work this fuel tap. Man, the stench is pretty bad. It's got this like varnish smell that's in pretty bad shape here. So go ahead and get this out. Giving it a couple taps. It was a little stuck with the varnish. And another trick I like to do is, instead of letting the nut just drop into the tank, I'll use the tool to hook the nut out. That gives you an indication of how the tank looks. You see that varnish buildup that's on the nut? In pretty bad shape, so we're gonna have to clean that out. This fuel tap was new at one point, so we replaced it. They cut the vent tube too short, I can tell you that. You typically have to cut the vent tube, but not that short. But we'll visit that in a moment. So. The oil tank, I've drained the oil tank. You know, there's probably still some residual oil. The cap just pops off. Typically it's a 15 or 17 millimeter nut at the very end. So we'll get a long extension and go ahead and pull that out. So I have a couple long extensions here, all the way at the bottom, and I'm on the nut. You need to use a deep socket. There's a filter on there. Go ahead and just crack that loose. Pretty straightforward, just keep on spinning until this banjo at the end of the line comes right off. I can tell the bolt should be off, and now this came right off. So that's the little screen for the filter. There's the gasket. Oftentimes this gasket can be reused. It's against this steel washer right here. So when you have a line you're going to remove and discard, just always take a razor blade and just give it a little relief cut, and then it should just pull right off the barbs, no problem. So now that that's out, you should be able to just turn the tank. If it's really tight, sometimes I'll turn the tank and that will loosen that nut. If it's really tight, you may need to take a set of channel locks on that plastic nut. Just take extra care, it is plastic. That thing is really tight. Let's see if we can salvage it without, there we go. Didn't crack it. Of course, you can buy that nut as a replacement part if needed. There we go. So it's got some large threads here. And I'll get this tank out of here. So you can see there's still some oil showing up in the sight glass. So just keep that in mind, it may drip. And you can see the nut that's left behind. And this slides right off, typically. There's gonna be a rubber washer that's kind of got a tapered shape to it. And if you're having difficulty getting this off, you can pry that out and then you'll be able to get this right off, no problem. So that pulls off. There's that rubber gasket that we're gonna go ahead and replace. Go ahead and pull that out. So we got the hole where the fuel tap resides plugged up with some type of stopper. And in the tank is what I'm gonna do is put a bunch of random old nuts and bolts or whatever you have, something to braid the tank. And I have a little pot to kind of contain the acetone that I'm going to use. So you can carefully pour acetone, or you can use MEK, would be another solvent that would work. That's strong enough to eat up that varnish. And acetone's relatively safe. It's highly flammable, but you know, it's nail polish remover essentially. So you pour a small amount in there, and I still have the old gasket in the lid. And now that's in there, I'll show you what you do. And just kind of get in all positions. You may want to do this for like 10 minutes or 5 minutes, however much it takes to clean out. And I don't need to tip it upside down because I know the top of the tank's really clean. There's not much varnish. And you take a peek in there every once in a while. Nice thing about these vintage Vespas, they have a nice large cap to check things out. And want to get a flashlight in there and check it out. If it's really, really dirty, you may even leave this overnight. Let it just eat away at the coating. Another thing I found that works pretty good, after you break up the coating, you can, the varnish in there, you could, with the pressure washer, you can go in there with hot soapy water and pressure wash the rest out. And I may do that after this. And of course, you want to dry the tank out quite well after you pressure wash the tank. So I've been shaking it around. Let's see what drains out of the tank. And you know that the acetone normally is clear. Let's see how it looks. Okay, yeah, you can see there's like flakes, and it's kind of like yellowish amber color. And get most of that out. Maybe it'll get some of the nuts out of there. The other way you could do it is just tip the tank right here, and you should be able to grab them. Or even if you just flip it upside down, and most of them will come out of the lid. So. And retrieve them out, no problem. And you may want to repeat this. I'm going to go over to the pressure washer, give it the last pressure wash, and then I'll take like a heat gun and dry out the tank. You know, not so much heat that I'm really overheating the tank, but enough where you make sure there's no water left behind. And oftentimes I'll spray something like WD-40 in the tank, and then the tank is prepared to be put back together. Very important to have a clean tank. The fuel filter will never, you're just gonna always have problems with a clogged fuel filter. And if you have a rusty tank, you need to do something to either get rid of that rust, seal it up with one of the tank seal kits, or just replace the tank. And you can see acetone kind of eats up a glove like this. It's not really hurting my hands, just really cold. Not the most dangerous stuff. Don't want to leave it on the tank. This original paint is quite resilient. Let's clean it pretty nice actually, but If it's been a repainted tank, you got to be careful because acetone may take the paint right off. So, and in there it's much cleaner. Still could use a little bit more work, and we'll finish that off with a pressure washer. So I got my brand new fuel tap kit. And it includes a couple different items. You got the fuel tap itself, a new clip, a new nut, and the gasket on the bottom of the fuel tap. The filter is brand new, the internal filter that is. So I was hoping to use the American style selector casting, but unfortunately with these newer style fuel taps, it's much thicker and a different style. So we're just gonna go ahead and put this back in. And I'll just have to mark on the fuel tap which positions are which. So put the little wave washer in there and just go ahead and put it back together. FYI, you could rebuild this. Like I suggested, you buy the 4-hole gasket that's underneath this and overhaul the fuel tap if you wanted to. If I did have an older fuel tap, I would rebuild one. I dug through my old parts and had no older fuel taps. They just have all either been in too poor a shape to save, or just you know, discard them over the years. And one thing you can do is always make sure it works fine, turns very smooth, and even if it doesn't turn so smooth, I'd recommend spraying some type of lubricant into the fuel tap. Like you could just get a little bit in there, just a light lubricant, and work it into the fuel tap. Before you have it all back in the tank, last thing you want is it to be difficult to turn. So another option, I could put the European lever in there, but we'll be fine. We'll just put this in. So we have our fuel tank. This is the front of the tank. The oil tank's towards the front. This needs to go towards the front. Obviously the rod goes to it. Let's put this in and see how it reaches. So it looks like that's gonna work fine. Sometimes you gotta cut the vent tube shorter. The vent tube needs to just nearly touch the top of the tank. If it's any lower, you're gonna have a fuel tap that won't ever turn off. And that's the vent tube right there, it's a brass tube. Pretty easy to cut down if it needed to. You can use a copper pipe cutter, much like, you know, the one you cut like plumbing pipes, like 1/2-inch plumbing pipes. This nut's got like a chamfer on the inside, and we'll just go ahead and drop that down onto the vent tube. And with the fuel tap tool, kind of like threading a needle in a haystack. Once you get the hang of it, it's not too bad. But you just look down the tank and get it started. And a third or a quarter of a turn at a time. Just keep on tightening the tap. And you want to keep that pointed towards the front. It's pretty easy to turn the tap. I'll show you a trick I have when I'm pretty close to the last turn. So the tap body's got these flats on it, and I tend to like to put it in a vise like this. You don't want to squeeze it down. It is pretty soft pot metal, but you can squeeze it down, and then you can kind of keep it referenced to the approximately like the front of the tank, and go back in there and give it the final turn. You know, just don't need to go too crazy on tightening these down, just enough to compress the gasket. So take the plastic nut, go ahead and slide it up there. Take the gasket, you may want to put a small amount of oil or grease on it, and just slide it with this bevel towards the bottom. Push that up the tube. Pretty straightforward. You just leave it about there. We'll take our oil tank and go ahead and get that onto the thing, and then you can push this all the way home. And I'll just get the nut started. You don't want to tighten it down just yet. We'll just get it started. Make sure it doesn't cross thread, it's plastic. And you can tell that the gasket's getting a little tighter now because the tank doesn't want to turn as freely. Next we'll get the Banjo bolt. So it's this guy right here. And you have this gasket with the washer here. We could separate the gasket. I think I'll just put a new gasket since I have it here. And oftentimes this gasket's kind of stuck to the washer, kind of separates like such. Newer styles always this rubber gasket versus that kind of hard paper rubber covered thing. Just like that. And this will also point towards the front of the tank. So drop the nut down in the bottom of the well now that the tank's kind of holding in place. You drop it down in there, you shake it around, and right when you see it's about right where the hole is, kind of just look down there and go ahead and thread that right through. So it's like such. And again, just like the other thing, I'm just gonna hold it in the vise right here, make the job a little easier. And I'll take my long extension, drop it down, and it should start threading, just no problems there. So don't want to get too crazy on tightening this because we may need to make some adjustments to the location of the fuel tank, but I approximately have it where it needs to go. And the next step is we'll put it in the scooter frame and see how this turns right now. I could just tight enough where I can turn it. It's not tight to the final position. I'm gonna go over to the scooter frame and make sure this threads right through and is centered in the oil grommet in the frame. So the frame grommet's in place. I'm not gonna mess with this, it's still in good shape. And see how it moves around? There's some give to it, so no problems there. And we approximately have that where we think it needs to be. And you wanna drop the tank in, kind of tip it in, and let's see where this ends up. I can tell it's more this way. You can reach in there and steer it around. So we'll make sure all the screw holes line up and just get it about right where it's halfway the point. And then when you lift it out, it should have very little resistance. So just double check it again, no problems there. Now we know the position of my oil tank. So go ahead and tighten this. You want to hold the oil tank so it doesn't rotate. And go ahead and tighten the ring nut. And then next, we want to make sure this little spigot points towards the front of the tank. So we'll hold that there. Get the long socket in there. And we should be able to tighten it. Don't want to get too, if you over tighten that, you'll break the oil spigot. Just enough to compress the gasket, and that's all we need. Go ahead and put the oil cap in. I'm gonna leave no oil in there for right now. Is what I always recommend is I build the whole entire tank. I'll fill it with oil and gasoline. And sometimes I'll even let it sit overnight and just make sure I don't have any leaks. The last thing you want to have is an oil leak inside the frame or a drip into the fuel through even a brand new fuel tap. Sometimes they'll leak a little bit, and that could be always a problem there. So you're wondering how to hold this. I don't recommend using a glue. You could use a little super glue. That's kind of holds okay. I typically just put a little bit of grease on this to hold it. And then over time, the compression and the gas swells up the gasket and that will hold it in place. So that's how that works. So we're gonna go ahead and get both the oil line and fuel line on. The easiest way to do this is these lines are kind of stiff and today it's a little cold here in the shop. Just put them in some hot water or boiling water And what that will do is soften up the lines. We'll let them sit there for a moment. I'm gonna get some other things ready. Water's not quite boiling, but it's pretty hot. I got a hose, just a standard hose clamp that works pretty good. ACL4 Mini is the part number on this for a standard run-of-the-mill hose clamp. If you have the original hose clip for the oil line, I would just recommend using that. These hose clamps are a little bit too large for the oil lines. There are oil line clips that do work, but you could use that. You don't need to put them on at first, but pretty much the oil line, you can see it's really rubbery now versus the other part that's stiff. And all you gotta do is push it right over the barbs, and it goes on so easy when they're heated up. And the way these little clips work is it's got the little slot. I know you can't see the contrast, but you could squeeze them, and we'll go ahead and slide that over the line. And these are pretty effective at clamping the line. So there you go. Now the line's on there tight, it's not coming off. We'll pretty much do the same with the fuel line. So it's very rubbery on the end. Find the spigot, which is pretty large, and just push that right over the barbs. So, and we'll go ahead and put the hose clamp, thread that over the line, and I'm working from underneath here. Go ahead and tighten that down. So we're gonna go ahead and put the fuel lever on. There's a little hole in this rod. The Euro fear lever obviously has the lever you act on upon, this one's got a little pin in there that engages with the plastic lever. So you put this little hitch pin right through and just kind of line it up. And one thing you gotta keep in mind, sometimes it hits the fuel tank or the oil tank, so we'll check the operation. It misses the oil tank, no problem. Sometimes you gotta turn that clip 180. No problems there, so everything's working perfect. Next, I'll fill both the oil tank with a quart of oil and the fuel tank with gas, and we'll see if there's any leaks. So I have a quart of fresh oil, or a liter. This is the oil I use in my own scooters, anything with an oil injection on it. Oil 710 is a part number for the Model 710. It's a full synthetic ester-based oil that is compatible with the oil injection pump. Some of the racing oils that are not compatible with the oil injection. So we'll go ahead and pour that in. Nice thing, they do have a spout that works really well with the oil tank. And I tended to recommend just putting 1 liter at a time. And you can see the oil line is starting to be taken up by oil, and you can even see the level in the tank. The capacity of this tank is 1.5 liters. So pretty much a half liter is right when you see that little white sight glass in there. Anytime you see the sight glass there's a little low, it means you can pour pretty much a whole liter into the oil tank. I see some people, they just add a little oil every once in a while. No need to do that. Just wait till the sight glass shows up and then you're good. A half liter is still good for a couple tanks of fuel. So you'd be safe with, even if you saw the bubble, the white finger that's inside the oil tank. So you see that the oil line is taking up most of the oil. I put it below the oil line and it will flow right out, no problem. Take a 5mm screw and plug that, just keep the oil from coming out. And if you leave it overnight, you could check this for leaks. Everything seems pretty tight. I don't think there's gonna be any problems there. So if you had the fuel tank full of gas, maybe I would just typically fill it about half so it's not sloshing around, and that's enough to test the reserve. So when you have the lever turned all the way clockwise with a standard fuel tap, that's gonna be your closed position. If it was the original American fuel tap, it would be the center position. But center would be on, and the last position would be reserve. So you check that, make sure when it's all the way off that there's no fuel coming out of the fuel line even when it sits for an hour at a time. It shouldn't even be a trickle. It should be all the way closed. So I got the tank ready to go. We verified that there's no leaks and it's good to go into the frame. You want to make sure these two grommets are in place, are in good condition. There's both an oil line grommet that goes through the frame. So it's the rubber grommet protect the hose from chafing, and then this is your rubber fuel line grommet. Both are in very nice shape. I'm not going to bother replacing those. Next, we're going to carefully thread both the fuel line and the oil line through their respective grommets here. So, got quite a bit of wiring on these bikes, so it's a little tight. You know, get the fuel line through. It's the longer of the two hoses, and it just pops right through like such. And you should be able to feel it from this side. And just get it started. Then next we'll take the oil line. It kind of routes from the front, loops around, and then it will pop through this front grommet right here. So very important that it's critical that you get these lines through the correct grommets and they don't cross over each other, and you don't push the grommets through. And if you're having trouble pushing the grommets through, you could always spray some silicone spray lubricant on the outsides of the lines, or even soapy water works. Just something to lubricate. You probably don't want to use grease. Hopefully my big head's not in the way. And it looks like the grommet's going to push through, or the line's going to push through without pushing the grommet through, so we're doing good. There, all right. And we'll just carefully rest the tank in there for right this moment. I'm going to start feeding the fuel line through the air box. So pull the lid back off. And the rubber grommet that's in the bottom of the air box is still in good shape. And typically you could just feed this right through. This line is really nice to use for the Vespas. I don't really recommend using any other type of line. This is original style fuel line. It's stiff enough to easily use, and you can already see it's too long at this point. That's okay. So now we'll go ahead and drop the fuel tank in. I have most of the slack pulled out of both the lines. You have the oil tank sight glass, and we'll just kind of lever that in. And it's a combination of getting the sight glass through, and also the fuel selector rod, which will kind of want to come through. Nice thing about these frames, there's quite a bit of room to get the fuel selector rod through, but you got to make sure you get it through simultaneous as you're getting the sight glass through. So there you go. There's no stress on that sight glass. A lot of people break those sight glasses, just not paying attention. I'm not going to bolt the fuel tank down, but I'm going to add more fuel to the tank. Right now, make sure your fuel tap's closed in the closed position, so you don't end up with gas all over the place. I kind of watch that. And if you're to the top of that fuel filter, that means you're covering the reserve position. So both it will run in reserve and on position. And I recommend with these fuel tanks never filling them more than within 1 inch of the top. Otherwise, you're going to end up with an engine that floods when you park the scooter. The extra gas will go down the vent tube and flood out the carburetor. So just a little tip. So at this point, fuel tank's set in place. You want to pull the excess slack of the oil line out. And you don't need to necessarily trim the oil line, but you do want to have a little bit of a loop in here, because as the engine pivots up, this oil line will need to flex. And same with the fuel line. You want to pull any of the extra slack out of it. And it gets to a point where it tips the whole tank. Now you look at that fuel line, that's about 3-4 inches too long. We'll go ahead and take this fuel banjo off. No, that I never tightened when I put the carburetor back together when we rebuilt the carburetor. It's typically the way I like to leave them. So you have the fuel line with almost no slack where when I pull on it, it tips the tank. You want to push it back maybe about 3/4 inch. Again, you got to have a little bit of a loop in there. And then I'll go ahead and go in there and cut it about flush with the top right there. So, and this is a specific hose cutter. You can use a razor blade to cut the hose just as well. We'll go ahead and drop the hose clamp onto the line. And I don't have the opportunity to heat the hose, but the fortunate thing is the barb that's on the carburetor side is usually a little bit smaller. So you get it on there a little easier without the aid of hot water to soften up the line. So I'm just holding the hose and kind of forcing the barb onto the hose. The other thing you can do is put a little bit of grease or oil on the barb, and that would help it along. So it's pretty much on there at this point, and we'll rotate my hose clamp around. It's got to be toward the hump has to be towards the front of the scooter there. And of course there's other types of hose clamps. These ones just happen to be convenient and easy to use. Just with simple tools. I do have other types of hose clamps that need special tools. They work really well, but the special tools doesn't make it so user serviceable, you know, with a home shop, home mechanic. So get that pretty tight, pretty important. The back of the air box doesn't have the drain bolt in. We're gonna test the fuel tap, make sure there's fuel flow. So right now I'm gonna put in the on position, which is the center. And it's flowing out. That's perfect, good flow. And same with the reserve. Don't let too much go out. It kind of makes a mess. Gas isn't the safest thing to have out, but just want to prime the lines and verify fuel flow before you hook it up to the carburetor. So now that we know there's good fuel flow, go ahead and put the washer in there. And we know that the fuel tap shuts off. We tested that on the bench. And you take a flat screwdriver and tighten this down. And the last little bit, I just get a 10mm wrench and snug this. You use a combination wrench, use the closed end inside. So yeah, you just want to make sure it's pretty tight. Vibration can end up cutting that loose. Next, I want to take my oil line. I'm letting a little bit of a bubble go in there, see just a small amount of air. And for now, I'm just gonna push this on and test it. I'll put a hose clamp on there. These fit very, very tight. You could technically get away without a hose clamp, but typically I like to put some type of hose clamp on there. And the idea there is I have that bubble so I can verify that the oil pump's running. I want to see that oil go into the oil pump, make sure there's no problems. All right, the fun part. Let's get started. So we'll go ahead and turn the fuel flow on and let it flow to the carburetor. Look around the top of the carburetor, make sure there's no gas leaking from this top fuel filter lid. That's a very common spot for them to leak fuel. And if it's leaking from this lid, typically you'll end up with a scooter that's flooded out pretty easily. Allow the fuel to flow for a little bit. Turn the choke on. Make sure your spark plug's tight. A lot of times when you're checking timing or checking compression or rebuilding the motor, you don't have the spark plug all the way tightened in. Go ahead and snap the cap on, and we'll see if this starts right up. Turn the ignition on. Choke is on, fuel's on. First kick. Just turning up the idle speed so it idles. A nice quiet motor. I'm watching my oil line, see if it primes. So you see it move. It's very slow at idle, but it just every once in a while moves. There it is. And it may need a little bit more adjustment of the carburetor mixture and idle speed. And then we'll button up the carburetor air box, take it for a test ride. I think we could put the air bellow back on. Let me show you the tricks there. So first of all, there's a little tooth right there and it lines up with the frame. And I have my fingers inside the air bellow. So I take my thumb in there and rotate it all the way around to get the air bellow around the lip of that intake. Another thing you could do with this air bellow is heat that up in hot water, and it makes it a little bit easier. And then I'm doing the same here. I'm reaching from the inside the air box and all the way around. I want to make sure it's seated, because a lot of times it looks like it's seated and it's not all the way around. So I could tell it just needs to go a little richer. To have a little bit stronger idle. Obviously I don't have an accurate reference with the air filter off the engine. And even while it's running, I could put the air filter all back together. You have this step screw right here. And just be very careful when you're working on a running motor. And the front screw. Make sure they're very tight. You don't want these screws coming loose into the motor. And you can see the air bubbles almost all the way gone. And I did prime the motor with a small amount of oil in the fuel tank, just to be safe. And in the next video, we'll make sure that the charging voltage is working. It looks like the headlight's working, no problem. Some of the stuff that only runs off the AC current when the motor's running. High beam, low beam's working. The little indicator on the dash is working. Sounds pretty good. Very quiet motor. We'll turn the fuel off and turn the ignition off. So there you go. We got a running scooter.
Good.
Oh, and Alice sneaking in there. On the next video, we'll lubricate all these cables. I want to take apart the front brakes, grease the front wheel bearings, just do some fine tuning, make sure the charging voltage is there, button up the tank, put the seat on. But we're nearly finished with the scooter. And I'll take it on a good long test ride, give it a good shakedown. I don't anticipate any issues with this scooter. This thing's like a new scooter. It's Robot from Vespa Motorsport and scooterwest.com. Hope everybody liked it. You probably never thought it would take so long to overhaul a fuel tank, but that's what it takes to overhaul the fuel tank and extra steps to do the oil tank. Robot here. Until next time, subscribe to our channel. You can watch all the other videos. You can watch the restoration, the P200 restoration video that we did about 7 years ago. Kind of covers all these steps in even more detail. Later.